What happened when an undercover CEO stepped onto the sorting line of his own waste facility and discovered a toxic culture hidden beneath piles of silence and neglect? Welcome, smart and thoughtful listeners. Today's story dives deep into what really happens when leadership shows up, listens, and takes action. From collapsing workers to ignored complaints, this CEO saw it all, and what he did next changed everything. Darren Holt had built GreenCore Environmental Solutions from a small local contractor into a nationally recognized waste management company. With facilities in 7 states and contracts with dozens of municipalities, he had earned a reputation as a forward-thinking leader who cared about sustainability and community impact. But over the past few months, something has changed. Complaints from the East Ridge facility had begun to pile up. Anonymous HR reports, maintenance requests backlogs, whispers of missing overtime pay, and unusually high staff turnover. Darren's executive team assured him it was just the nature of the job, but the details nagged at him. One worker mentioned unsafe equipment. Another referenced verbal abuse from a shift lead. Payroll issues had supposedly been addressed, but the reports didn't stop. Darren couldn't ignore the red flags any longer. He remembered his father's advice: if you want to know the truth, don't wait for a report. Go to the source. With that in mind, Darren devised a plan. He would go undercover, stripping away his title, his tailored suit, and his comfortable office to see what life on the floor was really like. Posing as Dale, a temp worker hired through an outside labor agency, he would join the sorting line on a week-long shift at the East Ridge facility. No one would know who he was, not the site manager, not the supervisors, not even the workers beside him. Darren wanted raw truth, unfiltered, and if what he suspected was even half true, there would be consequences. As he filled out the fake onboarding paperwork and stepped into the company-issued coveralls, a familiar tension gripped his chest. He wasn't sure what he'd find in the noise and grime of the floor, but he knew this: he couldn't fix what he didn't see, and it was time to see everything. The moment Darren Holt stepped through the industrial gates of the East Ridge facility as Dale, the temp worker, he felt the shift in atmosphere. The air was thick with the scent of machine oil, rust, and warm plastic. Conveyor belts roared in the distance, clanking metal drowned out conversation, and fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like impatient insects. Wearing steel-toed boots, a hard hat, and oversized safety goggles, Darren looked nothing like a CEO. Just another new face among a sea of worn-out workers. He reported to the break room as instructed, where a disinterested clerk handed him a safety vest and pointed him toward the sorting floor. That's where he met Mason Trigg, the senior line supervisor. Mason barely glanced at Darren before grunting, "Another one? Hope you last longer than the last guy." He barked instructions without looking back and didn't bother learning Darren's name. To him, Dale was disposable. Darren played along, silently observing. The floor was chaos. Plastic bottles, shards of glass, and bits of metal whirled by at relentless speed. Workers lined the belt, plucking recyclables with practiced fatigue. No one spoke unless necessary. As Darren took his place at the line, Jenna Alvarez, a younger worker beside him, offered a timid nod before quickly returning to her task. He could already sense the fear in her posture. Mason stalked the aisle, arms crossed, glaring at every misstep. Within an hour, Darren's gloves were soaked with grime and sweat dripped down his back. This was the job, gritty, exhausting, and thankless. But it wasn't just the physical labor that struck him. It was the silence, the unspoken tension in every movement, the way people flinched when Mason passed. Darren had come expecting inefficiencies. What he found instead was fear, and that told him something was deeply wrong. Within the first hour of his shift, Darren felt the full weight of the dysfunction simmering beneath the surface. Mason Trigg barked orders like a drill sergeant, pacing behind the workers on the sorting line with the kind of swagger that came from unchecked authority. His voice cut through the din of machinery like a whip. "Pick it up, Alvarez! You missed another aluminum can! What, you blind?" Jenna Alvarez flinched, but didn't respond. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the next item on the belt, her movements fast but uncertain. Darren, positioned just beside her, caught her nervous glances and shallow breathing. She was clearly trying to keep up, but Mason's presence was suffocating. "You new people are all the same," Mason muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "No grit, no brains, just waiting to quit after your first week." No one replied. The workers kept their heads down, eyes fixed on the endless stream of debris, afraid to slow down or speak up. Darren had been in leadership long enough to recognize what was happening. This was a fear-based workplace, and Mason ruled through ridicule. At one point, Jenna accidentally dropped a piece of glass, which shattered near her boots. Mason snapped, "You trying to lose a toe today? God, do we have to put up warning signs in crayon for you?" Jenna's cheeks flushed, but she stayed silent. Darren fought to keep his face neutral. He knew he couldn't intervene yet. His role was to observe, to see the full extent of the damage. But watching Mason berate Jenna with casual cruelty made his blood boil. If this was how he treated staff every day, Darren could only imagine how many others had been driven out. And now, he was determined to find out. As the day wore on, Darren began to see the deeper rot beneath the surface-level chaos. It wasn't just Mason's abrasive attitude, it was the entire environment that reeked of neglect and fear. The sorting line was flanked by piles of overflowing bins, and the stench of spoiled waste mixed with chemical residue clung to the air. One worker near Darren wore torn gloves duct-taped at the fingers. Another limped slightly, clearly working through an injury. When the belt jammed from an improperly sorted bundle, no one called for help. They simply glanced at Mason, who muttered something under his breath and stormed off to kick the control panel until it lurched back into motion. Jenna, still quiet and visibly anxious, winced every time Mason passed behind her. At one point, her hand brushed against a piece of jagged scrap metal. She barely flinched, just wiped the thin line of blood on her vest, and kept moving. Darren felt a pang of guilt. This was his company, his facility, and his people. And yet, they were enduring unsafe, degrading conditions with no one to advocate for them. During a short break, 2 older workers whispered near the vending machine. "Still no hazard pay from last month," one said. "Payroll's always late now." Darren listened, stunned. He'd signed off on those payments weeks ago. Where were the delays happening? He also noticed that safety signage was faded or missing, and the first aid kit in the break room was almost empty. The message was clear. No one cared, not the supervisors, not the manager, and certainly not Mason. The culture wasn't just tough, it was toxic. Employees weren't empowered, they were surviving. Darren realized then that the problem was no longer isolated, it was systemic, and he wasn't going to let it continue. It didn't take long for Darren to confirm that leadership at the Eastridge facility had all but disappeared. Ethan Drake, the site's operations manager, seemed more like a ghost than a supervisor. Darren saw him twice during his first full day, once as he emerged from his office to pour stale coffee, and once when a pallet tipped dangerously close to a worker near the loading dock. Both times, Ethan wore the same expression, bored, indifferent. When confronted about the near accident, he muttered, "Make sure it doesn't happen again," and shuffled back to his office, eyes glued to a tablet. There was no inquiry, no report, no corrective action. Darren's frustration deepened. He overheard conversations from the sorting line, workers talking about how maintenance requests went unanswered for weeks, how overtime was logged but rarely paid on time, how schedules changed without notice, and those who complained were given the worst shifts. Jenna confided in Darren during a water break that she'd reported Mason's behavior 3 times, but nothing had come of it. "Ethan just tells me to toughen up," she said softly. Darren's jaw clenched. Ethan wasn't just blind to the dysfunction, he was actively ignoring it. The worst part? He didn't seem malicious, he simply didn't care. Complacency had replaced accountability. Under his watch, toxic leadership was allowed to flourish, and the well-being of frontline workers had become an afterthought. Darren had always believed that leadership should be visible and engaged, especially in demanding environments like this. Instead, Ethan had created a vacuum, one that Mason was all too eager to fill with intimidation. As Darren returned to the line and saw Mason berating another worker over a minor mistake, he knew it wasn't just Mason who had failed. It was Ethan too, and the consequences were on full display. By the 3rd day, the pressure cooker environment of East Ridge reached its inevitable boil. It was a blistering afternoon, the facility's industrial fans barely cutting through the sweltering heat, and the sorting line was moving faster than ever. Jenna Alvarez had been pushing herself beyond exhaustion, her face flushed, her hands moving robotically, sweat soaking through her uniform. Darren kept an eye on her as Mason barked louder than usual, his voice full of venom. "Pick it up, Alvarez. You want to get written up again?" Jenna didn't answer. Her legs wobbled as she tried to steady herself. Then, without warning, she collapsed. A crash echoed as she hit the concrete floor beside the conveyor. The line didn't stop. Mason rolled his eyes. "Unbelievable. Drama queen," he muttered. Darren rushed to her side, checking her pulse and calling for help. Other workers hesitated, unsure if they were allowed to intervene. Ethan finally emerged from his office, annoyed more than alarmed. "What now?" he grumbled, hands in pockets. "She's overheated," Darren snapped, "and this place is running like a furnace." Ethan shrugged. She should have taken a break. The indifference lit a fire in Darren. Jenna was barely conscious, her breathing shallow, her face pale. She hadn't taken a break because she'd been afraid of Mason's ridicule and Ethan's neglect. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of a culture that punished vulnerability and rewarded silence. As paramedics arrived and wheeled Jenna away, the rest of the crew watched in stunned silence. Darren's fists were clenched, but his mind was clear. That moment crystallized everything he had suspected. It wasn't just about poor leadership or broken equipment. It was about dignity, stripped away piece by piece until someone collapsed under the weight. Jenna's fall wasn't just a crisis. It was a wake-up call. The atmosphere in the break room after the shift was tense and heavy with fatigue. Workers sat slumped in plastic chairs, nursing sore limbs and avoiding eye contact, the earlier incident with Jenna lingering like a shadow. Darren stood near the wall, heart pounding but expression calm. It was time. He removed his safety goggles and hard hat, pulled off the temporary ID badge that read Dale, and ran a hand through his damp hair. The room began to quiet as he stepped forward. "Before anyone leaves, there's something I need to say," he began, his voice carrying over the low hum of a vending machine. "My name isn't Dale, it's Darren Holt. I'm the CEO of GreenCore Environmental Solutions." A collective silence fell like a dropped weight. Mason, leaning against the sink with a smug expression, straightened abruptly. Ethan, standing in the corner with his arms crossed, froze, the color draining from his face. Eyes widened. Chairs creaked. Someone whispered, "Wait, what?" Darren let the shock settle before continuing. "I came here undercover because I kept hearing that something was wrong at this facility. Today, I saw it for myself. Unsafe conditions, disrespectful leadership, a culture of fear." He looked directly at Mason, whose usual arrogance was replaced with uncertainty, then to Ethan, who shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "I saw how you treat your team, how you ignore reports, how you dismiss real concerns. That ends now." The room was silent, but the emotional tide had shifted. For the first time, workers looked up, curious, cautious, and quietly hopeful. Darren wasn't just another suit sending memos from a distant office. He had seen them, heard them, and now he was speaking for them. The masks were off, and so was the complacency. The reckoning had begun. Darren didn't wait for excuses. The moment his identity was revealed, he stepped into the role he had always intended to reclaim, not just as CEO but as a leader who stood with his people. "Let's get one thing straight," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't a warning. This is changing." He turned first to Mason, who now stood stiff and pale, his bravado gone. "You're done here," Darren stated. Mason opened his mouth, but no words came. "Pack your things and leave the premises, effective immediately." Mason looked toward Ethan, silently pleading for backup but found none. Darren pivoted to Ethan next. "As for you, you've allowed this culture to fester. You ignored complaints, neglected safety, and turned a blind eye to cruelty. You're placed on administrative leave, pending a full performance review. A new interim manager will be appointed within 24 hours. Ethan stammered something unintelligible, but the decision had been made. Then Darren addressed the entire team. "No more missing hazard pay, no more broken equipment sitting idle for weeks. Starting today, every maintenance ticket will be tracked and followed up. Schedules will be built with your input, safety gear will be replaced immediately. And anyone who treats a coworker with disrespect, no matter their rank, will not be part of this company." He turned to Jenna's empty seat, his tone softening. What happened to her should never happen again. Around the room, heads nodded, some slowly, some with relief. The fear that once lingered in the break room began to lift, replaced by cautious optimism. Darren wasn't offering empty promises. He was delivering action. For the first time in a long while, the employees at East Ridge saw something they hadn't seen from leadership in years: accountability, integrity, and someone who actually gave a damn. With Mason gone and Ethan removed from his post, a quiet shift swept through the break room. The silence broke not with fanfare, but with hesitant voices finally rising. Darren pulled a folding chair to the center of the room and sat down, not as a boss issuing orders, but as someone ready to listen. "If there's more I need to know," he said, "now's the time to speak." At first, no one moved. Then Malik Boyd, a forklift operator with oil-stained gloves, stepped forward. "We've been logging overtime for months without seeing the pay. We're told it's a system delay, but it never gets fixed." Darren nodded, making notes. Sasha Renner, who handled materials by the dock, added, "Supplies come in late, and when we run out of basic items, we're told to get creative. I've been reusing sorting bins way past their replacement date." A young worker named Theo, barely out of high school, spoke up too. "The fryers in the compactor bay haven't been working right for weeks. We reported it twice, nothing happened." Each voice brought a new revelation: missed safety drills, ignored medical claims, lost schedule requests. The stories poured out like floodwater behind a broken dam. Darren listened without interrupting, his expression serious but calm. He wasn't just hearing complaints, he was absorbing a full picture of neglect that had been buried under bureaucracy and fear. "You've been holding this in too long," he finally said. "That ends now." For the first time, employees weren't being dismissed or talked over, they were being heard, and as the room slowly filled with conversation and cautious nods, Darren saw something important return to the workers' faces: dignity. The silence was over, their voices were rising, and so was the standard for how they deserved to be treated. 3 weeks later, the East Ridge facility looked and felt like a different place. The broken conveyor motors had been replaced, new safety gear was issued to every employee, and the air inside the sorting bay, while still thick with hard work, no longer reeked of neglect. A new interim manager, Carla Nguyen, had stepped in with a clear mandate: prioritize people. She walked the floor daily, greeted employees by name, and made sure every maintenance request was logged and resolved within 48 hours. Jenna Alvarez, now recovered from her collapse, had returned with renewed confidence. Darren had personally offered her a spot in the company's supervisor development program, and she'd begun mentoring new hires, an unexpected role she carried with quiet pride. Payroll was finally consistent, shifts were fairly distributed, and the toxic atmosphere that once defined the facility had dissipated. Darren, true to his word, continued unannounced visits not just to East Ridge, but to other locations as well, determined to ensure what happened there was never repeated. The story of his undercover experience spread through the company like wildfire, becoming a symbol of real accountability in an industry too often ruled by indifference. Workers who had once felt disposable now felt seen. Their voices weren't just heard, they were driving change. As Darren walked the floor one final time before returning to headquarters, Jenna caught his eye and smiled. "Thank you," she said. He paused and replied, "No, thank you. You reminded me why this company exists in the first place." As he stepped outside into the crisp morning air, Darren felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace of mind. Because leadership isn't about watching from above, it's about standing shoulder to shoulder in the grit, listening to the people who keep everything moving, and building a future worth working for. The story of Darren Holt's undercover experience at the East Ridge facility reveals a powerful lesson. Leadership without visibility breeds dysfunction. No matter how well-intentioned policies may be at the top, if they don't reach the people on the ground, they're meaningless. Darren learned that it's not enough to delegate responsibility and trust reports. Real insight requires proximity. By stepping into the shoes of his frontline workers, he saw the truth. Fear, neglect, and silence had replaced respect, safety, and communication. But more importantly, the story teaches that change is possible when leadership chooses to listen, act, and be present. Accountability must start at the top, but it thrives when employees are empowered to speak without fear. A healthy workplace culture isn't built by authority, it's built through empathy, consistency, and courage. Darren's decision to confront the problems head-on not only transformed a failing facility, but reignited trust across an entire company. The core takeaway is clear: when leaders lead with humility and workers are treated with dignity, organizations thrive. Real leadership isn't about titles, it's about action, responsibility, and the willingness to get your hands dirty to build something better for everyone.